I never believed in ghosts. Not until I started working the night shift at St. Benedict's Hospital. For over 20 years, I've walked these halls, helping patients through their darkest hours. But the things I've seen during those long, lonely nights, they've stayed with me, haunted me in ways I can barely explain. This hospital holds secrets that reach out from the shadows. And tonight, I'm going to tell you about them. These are the stories that changed me forever. Mr. Donovan was an elderly man, a heart patient, admitted into room 306, a room tucked away at the far end of the 3rd floor. From the moment I first stepped into that room, something felt off. It was always cold, no matter how high we cranked the heat. On my second night with Mr. Donovan, I was doing my rounds when I heard it. A low, almost imperceptible whisper. I froze, my heart pounding. It was coming from Mr. Donovan's room. I opened the door slowly, the creak of the hinges echoing in the stillness. The room was dark, but I could make out Mr. Donovan's figure lying still in his bed. The whispering stopped as I stepped inside. I took a deep breath and approached his bed. That's when I noticed something strange. His eyes were open, wide and glassy, staring straight ahead, but there was no life behind them. He was dead. I backed away, a chill crawling up my spine. Suddenly, the whisper returned, louder this time, coming from all around me. It was his voice, rasping, desperate.
"Help me, please."
I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back at the nurse's station. The next morning, we moved his body to the morgue. But that night, I was haunted by the sound of his voice. I could hear it even in my dreams. A pleading whisper that wouldn't let go. A few nights later, I was assigned to room 306 again. As I passed by the room, the door, which I was sure had been closed, creaked open slowly, as if inviting me inside. I could barely breathe as I peered into the darkness. My flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of light, I saw him. Mr. Donovan sitting up in his bed, his eyes locked onto mine, his mouth moving as if trying to speak. I screamed, and the light went out. When it flickered back on, the room was empty. I couldn't get Donovan out of my head. The way he looked at me, the way his words hung in the air. It was as if he had reached across time itself to deliver a message I didn't understand. I knew I wouldn't be able to rest until I found out more about him. So, after my shift, I made my way to the record section. It's a part of the hospital that most people avoid. Old, dusty, and full of memories better left undisturbed. But I needed answers. The basement was cold, and the air was thick with the scent of old paper and decay. I found the filing cabinets that held the records from the 1920s, my fingers trembling as I opened the drawer. The old papers rustled as I sifted through them, searching for any mention of Donovan. Donovan had been a patient at St. Benedict's during the war, admitted for severe trauma. The file described him as a soldier, haunted by the horrors he had witnessed on the battlefield. He had been placed in room 306, the same room I had been in earlier that night. As I read on, the details grew darker. The nurses back then had reported strange occurrences around Donovan. Unexplainable sounds, objects moving on their own, lights flickering when he was near. It seemed that the terror he had experienced in life had followed him even in death. But the final entry in the file sent a chill down my spine. It read, "Patient deceased. Body never recovered. Room remains unoccupied. Staff refuse to enter." I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. The man I had spoken to, the man who called himself Donovan, he wasn't just a ghost. He was a lost soul, trapped in that room, in that moment, forever. And the room, it wasn't unoccupied. Not anymore. I closed the file and backed out of the record section, my hands shaking. The hospital felt different now. Darker, more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew the truth. I had seen him, I had spoken to him, and he was still there, waiting in room 306. As I walked back down the hallway, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the cold, empty walls, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I quickened my pace, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. When I finally reached the elevator, I jabbed the button with trembling fingers, glancing over my shoulder as I waited for the doors to open. The hallway stretched out behind me, dimly lit and eerily quiet. But just as the elevator doors slid open, I saw it. The faint outline of a figure standing at the end of the corridor, watching me. It was Donovan, his eyes hollow and dark locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of cold fear wash over me. The elevator doors closed and I was plunged into darkness. But even as I descended, I could still feel his gaze, as if he were reaching out to me, pulling me back to that room. When I finally stepped out into the lobby, I was shaking. I never went back to room 306, and I made sure to avoid that entire floor whenever I could. But even now, I can't forget Donovan. Can't forget the way he looked at me, the way his voice seemed to echo in my mind. I know now that some things are better left in the past, buried and forgotten. But I also know that in places like St. Benedict's, the past never truly dies. It lingers, waiting for someone like me to stumble upon it, to remember. And sometimes, just sometimes, it reaches out from the darkness, desperate to be seen.